The parking garage felt different the moment she stepped inside it, as if the air itself had shifted. The late hour had drained the place of sound and movement, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint drip of water echoing from somewhere deep between the concrete pillars. Her boots clicked steadily against the ground as she walked toward her car, posture relaxed, shoulders loose, mind alert. Years of training had taught her that danger rarely announced itself loudly. It whispered, it lingered, it waited. She sensed them before she fully saw them, two figures separating from the shadows near the far column. Not drunk, not lost. Too coordinated, too quiet. Her pace didn't change, but her awareness sharpened instantly. Peripheral vision caught the way one man angled his body to cut off her path while the other drifted wider, circling like he was following an unspoken plan. Civilian instincts might have screamed panic. Hers simply cataloged details. Height, reach, footwear, breathing patterns. "Hey," the first man called out, his voice casual in a way that didn't quite fit. "Got a minute?" She stopped a few steps short, not close enough to be touched, not far enough to seem afraid. "I'm busy," she replied evenly, eyes steady but not challenging. The second man smirked, exchanging a glance with his partner, as if they'd already decided how this would end. "That's so," the first said, stepping closer. "Won't take long." She shifted her weight subtly, aligning her body without drawing attention. Her right hand hovered near her jacket pocket, not reaching, just ready. She noticed now what she hadn't wanted to be wrong about. The second man's hand disappeared inside his coat, movement too deliberate to ignore. When it emerged, the dull black shape of a Glock caught the light, and the world narrowed to essentials. The gun rose smoothly, stopping inches from her face. Cold metal, poor trigger discipline, a trembling wrist masked by forced bravado. "Don't scream," the man holding the gun said, breath fast, eyes darting. "Don't do anything stupid." She raised her hand slowly, palms open, expression unreadable. Her heart rate barely changed. Fear had been burned out of her a long time ago, replaced by focus. She studied the man's stance, the angle of his elbow, the way his weight leaned forward instead of back. Amateur. Dangerous, but sloppy. The first man laughed nervously, trying to enjoy the moment. "See, easy. Now just relax," she said calmly, her voice cutting through his sentence. Not loud, not aggressive, just controlled. The word unsettled them more than shouting ever could. The gunman blinked, momentarily confused by her tone. Victims didn't sound like that. She let her eyes meet his fully now, and something in her gaze made his smile fade. "You're shaking," she added quietly. "That makes this worse for everyone." "Shut up," he snapped, pressing the gun closer. His finger tightened slightly on the trigger. In that instant, time slowed, not in a cinematic way, but in the sharp clarity she'd felt countless times before. Training kicked in automatically, distance measured, options narrowed, consequences calculated. She knew exactly what would happen if she waited another second. She also knew exactly how to end it. "You still have a chance to walk away," she said, almost gently. The first man scoffed, but his confidence cracked. "You think you're tough or something?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her body was already moving, muscles responding faster than conscious thought. The garage lights buzzed overhead, the concrete walls closing in, as the moment stretched tight, right before everything broke. The moment she decided to act, the garage seemed to shrink around her. Every step, every micro movement had been rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind, each scenario a puzzle with only one correct solution. The gunman was leaning slightly forward, overconfident in his perceived control, his eyes flicking nervously as if he couldn't quite believe how easy this had been supposed to be. But she had noticed every detail, the way his grip tightened when he tried to steady the weapon, the slight shift of his weight that left him off balance, the angle of his elbow that made a strike predictable. This wasn't luck, it was calculation, honed over years of experience in places that few civilians could imagine. Her hands moved with precision. One motion to the side, redirecting the gun away from her face without touching it too hard to alert him, yet forceful enough to compromise his hold. The Glock clattered to the ground with a sharp metallic ring that echoed off the walls. The man's jaw dropped, disbelief painted across his features as he stumbled backward. The second man, who had been watching from the corner, suddenly realized that his partner was no longer in control. Panic replaced his smugness instantly, his instincts screaming at him to flee. But she was already on him, closing the distance before he could even draw a second weapon from his coat. She struck with deliberate efficiency. Her hand found the soft spot just below his jaw, twisting in a motion that snapped his head to the side, disorienting him instantly. He tried to recover, to lunge, but she had already calculated his path and adjusted her stance accordingly. With a series of rapid movements, each one controlled, precise, and measured, she incapacitated him without causing unnecessary injury, using leverage, balance, and speed. He hit the floor with a thud, dazed, his weapon skidding out of reach. Neither man had expected this. Neither man had trained for this. And that difference, years of rigorous Navy SEAL training versus casual arrogance, was starkly clear in the silence that followed her actions. Even as the adrenaline surged through her body, she maintained a calm exterior. Her breathing was steady, controlled, almost meditative. She scanned the garage for additional threats, noting escape routes, potential reinforcements, and the nearest security cameras. Her eyes flicked between the two men, both sprawled and struggling to comprehend what had just happened. One of them attempted to rise, a foolish effort driven by ego rather than reason. She stepped closer, her presence dominating, her posture relaxed yet unyielding. One precise kick to his midsection sent him sprawling again, gasping, and finally, reluctantly, he stayed down. For a moment, the garage held its breath. The only sounds were the distant hum of the city outside, the echo of her own footsteps as she shifted her weight, and the metallic scrape of the dropped gun. Her mind raced, not with panic, but with tactical clarity, thinking about what needed to happen next, securing the area, preventing their escape, and ensuring that no one else was endangered. It was methodical, it was controlled, and it was effective. Then, almost as if sensing that their final realization had arrived, one of the men whispered her name in disbelief. The ID she had dropped earlier, a small insignia partially visible in her wallet, caught his attention. Recognition dawned slowly, horror replacing arrogance. Navy SEAL. The words fell from his lips like a curse, a bitter acknowledgement that the person they had threatened was not only capable but trained for far worse than they could ever imagine. Their previous confidence, built on intimidation and assumed weakness, collapsed instantly. She allowed herself a small, controlled exhale, keeping her eyes locked on them. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a calm sense of accomplishment. There was no celebration in her movements, no ego in her actions, just efficiency and the knowledge that a potentially deadly situation had been neutralized. The distant wail of approaching sirens reminded her that the authorities would arrive soon. Until then, the two men lay stunned, grappling with the realization that their arrogance had nearly cost them everything. She didn't gloat, she didn't taunt, she simply stood there, a figure of controlled power, an unmistakable warning to anyone who might underestimate her again. The sirens were still faint in the distance when she finally allowed herself to lower her guard slightly. The two men on the cold concrete floor were frozen, not entirely from fear, but from shock, the kind that comes when someone realizes that every assumption they made about a person was wrong. She moved deliberately toward her car, hands still visible, body relaxed yet radiating authority. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. She wasn't leaving the scene because she feared them, she was leaving because she had already done what needed to be done. Her mind ran through the next steps, procedural and calm, as if reviewing a checklist drilled into her during years of Navy SEAL operations. One of the men groaned, finally finding the courage to lift his head. His eyes widened as he took in the insignia still partially visible in her wallet, and then, perhaps more shockingly, he noticed the calm, almost casual way she surveyed the garage. You're a SEAL, he stammered, voice cracking. His partner didn't speak, but the wide-eyed look of disbelief said enough. They had walked in thinking they held all the power, only to find that the balance had shifted entirely in the span of seconds. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she knelt briefly to retrieve the gun, securing it with practiced precision. Her movements were fluid, almost effortless, but each one carried the weight of authority and experience. She could feel the tension still lingering in the air, a mix of fear and disbelief from the two men, and she used it to maintain control without a word. Navy SEAL training wasn't just about physical skill, it was about understanding psychology, reading opponents, and controlling situations without unnecessary force. This moment was a textbook example of that. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but sharp. Next time, Think twice before pointing a weapon at someone you don't understand. Her eyes scanned their faces, noting every micro-expression, the lingering fear, the desperate attempt to rationalize what had just happened, the dawning realization that they had been completely outclassed. There was no malice in her tone, only a quiet certainty that carried more weight than any threat. The sirens grew louder, now close enough that she could see the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the concrete walls. She stood, placing the gun carefully in her car's glove compartment, her movements deliberate, controlled. The men on the floor scrambled to their feet, not entirely out of courage, but out of instinct, some desperate need to reclaim dignity in the face of humiliation. But she had already anticipated this. One glance, one shift in her stance, and they froze, the lesson sinking in too late. When the police arrived, it was almost anticlimactic. She explained the situation succinctly, her calm demeanor carrying an authority that made the officers immediately understand the seriousness of the incident. The two men tried to speak, to justify their actions, but the evidence of their foolishness, their threats, their misjudgment, and the visible marks of her defensive maneuvers, spoke louder than any words they could muster. The officers glanced at her, noting the way she carried herself, the subtle efficiency in her explanation, and perhaps, though they didn't voice it, recognizing the disciplined confidence of someone who had been through far more than this confrontation. As she finally slid into her car and started the engine, the adrenaline that had fueled her earlier movements began to fade. But even as calm returned, her mind remained sharp, replaying the scene in meticulous detail. Every angle had been considered, every action precise, every threat neutralized. She allowed herself a small, private smile, not from pride, but from the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished without unnecessary harm. Before driving away, she glanced once more at the two men, still seated on the concrete, watching her with disbelief etched into their faces. They had underestimated her, assumed weakness where there was none, and paid for it with fear and humiliation. And as the garage receded behind her, she reflected on the strange irony, that even in civilian life, the skills and discipline honed through years of Navy SEAL training could turn the tables in an instant, proving that preparation, calmness under pressure, and decisive action were sometimes more powerful than brute force or intimidation ever could be. She drove off into the night, a figure of composed strength, leaving behind a story that the two men, and perhaps anyone who heard about it, would never forget. Her presence was a reminder that appearances were deceiving, and that true power often came not from weapons or bluster, but from unwavering skill, calm judgment, and unshakable confidence. And as the city lights blurred past her windshield, she allowed herself one final thought before the next challenge called. The world was full of people who underestimated her, and she would never let them forget the cost of that mistake.